On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This episode of Life Science Success is brought to you by 5280 Life Sciences Consulting. If you need help setting your strategy, meeting your operational goals, or you are selecting and implementing critical technology in your business, we should talk. Visit 5280lifescience.com to schedule a meeting and find out more.
Today, I'd like to welcome to the podcast, Ken Banta. Ken, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, why don't we just start with a little bit of your background? So tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, if you would.
Sure. I was actually born in Germany, so I started out in Europe, and I then was in the U.S. for a few years, went back with my family to Frankfurt, then to Milan, Italy, and studied at college at Amherst in Massachusetts. And then I was at Oxford for a couple of years as a Rhodes Scholar, as a matter of fact. And after that, ended up with Time Magazine for almost 10 years, mainly covering Eastern Europe, although doing other things as well during the fall of the wall. So it was a tremendous, interesting time to be there. And then I went into consulting for a couple of years and got headhunted to be in the healthcare business in the pharmaceutical industry with a company called Pharmacia and Upjohn, which I did not realize when I joined was going to be a complete train wreck of a company in its merger. But I survived that and joined up with a very impressive team to turn it around. And then subsequently did a similar role at Schering-Plough, which was another train wreck of a company at the time. And then went to Bausch & Lomb, which was not in quite such trouble, but it was a very, very dispirited, well-known brand at that point, which needed rejuvenating. And so I worked on that too. And now, for the last years, have been running the Vanguard Group for leadership, which is what it sounds like. We work with leaders to up their game, and we also help them with leadership in their own companies.
Okay. So those early experiences, it's interesting because I've done this a bit in my past as well. With GE Healthcare, they would acquire companies, and then oftentimes those companies couldn't scale to meet the demands of the acquisition. And do you feel like those early experiences help to kind of shape what you're doing now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a very important element of my development. I think prior to joining Pharmacia and Upjohn, I wouldn't have been able to really identify a turnaround if it came right in front of me. So I really had a lot to learn, but it was a kind of a baptism by fire of having to rescue a company or help rescue it. I think the things that I was most involved in were perhaps some of the most basic things to a rescue operation, which are the culture of the organization and the leadership culture and quality. And those are the things that I developed and experienced. And also, I think you could sometimes say that in some cases, over time, these things would be achieved anyway, but what we were seeking to do is to accelerate the pace of change. I have to say that in the case of Pharmacia and Upjohn, I think if we had not taken decisive action at the time that we did, it would not have survived.
It's good that there are people like you that can help, bridge companies, that help to at least point in the direction that companies should go. So in terms of the Vanguard Group, let's explore a little bit more in terms of what the focus of your company is. So you mentioned just a second ago, you focus on leaders and growing leaders. Can you provide a little bit more detail in terms of the key things that you work with leaders on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think almost everybody seems to talk about leadership these days, but what is actually achieved is a good question. And I think that what we're really focused on is two things. One is creating networks of leaders at the top levels of companies in the C-suite and in some cases in the board level, where they can do two things. They can really develop pragmatic leadership capabilities that they wouldn't ordinarily learn so quickly on the job. And the second thing is that we facilitate networking and interaction among these leaders that, again, often would not occur without this membership organization. And I guess it's important to say it is a membership organization. So we've evolved into a program that is what we call a network, the Vanguard Network. And it's a network of these senior leaders who are members of that organization. So they don't participate in programs in a kind of one-off way. It's not a bunch of conferences or events that stand alone. these are connected experiences that carry on through the course of a year. So it'll include forums, it will include smaller dialogue sessions, it will include happy hours, which are remarkably popular even on Zoom, believe it or not. And it also includes things like Q&As, video material, and other leadership development things and leadership development experiences. So it's I'd say it is a unique experience, and I think that's what makes it valuable and certainly interesting to me to help develop and lead it. The other thing that we do is related. We really apply similar approaches to the leadership and the leadership development of teams within companies. So on one hand, we've got the networks, which are executives coming from dozens of different organizations, but all with similar roles or similar ecosystems that they work in. At the other end of the spectrum, we're working with individual CEOs or C-suite leaders, helping them to develop the team around them, or in some cases to drive very profound change in their whole organization. And on one level, a good example would be that I'm working with a general counsel now on their personal development and their goals of becoming a GC in a large organization, managing the people that are part of their team. And I guess in a nutshell, seeking to become even more of a leader, not just a lawyer. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other, we're working with a very large IT system of about 500 people in a Midwestern healthcare system. And that's dedicated to helping them transform the whole organization from a group that has been historically plug-it-in people to strategic advisors to the organization on IT and AI and other tech-based things. So they have all the knowledge that's needed for that, but what is often missing is the customer touch and the emotional intelligence capabilities and other things that go into transforming yourself from a plugger-inner to an advisor.
Yeah, and it is interesting because the bridge from executive to from wherever you are or person that actually executes to executive and really strong leader sometimes can be a big bridge for people. And so having that coaching background is important. I also heard you point a lot to something that a lot of people today seem to refer to as mastermind groups. They have these groups of like-minded people that get together on a regular basis and kind of learn new things or explore new ideas, which also is absolutely key, especially in today's environment. And I feel like so many things are moving so fast overall. In transitioning some of that to Zoom, have there been any challenges that the Vanguard Group has faced or that your clients have faced?
That's a great question. And I think that, in fact, we have been pleasantly surprised by the transferability of a lot of what we do to Zoom. And interestingly, while there are some obvious downsides, of course, people like to be in human contact, not just electronic contact, and they like to share a dinner and not simply watch each other across the screen. Those are definitely issues, but in some ways, I think they're outweighed by the positives, which are that with Zoom, we can bring together people who wouldn't ordinarily be able to get together from different geographies without a huge amount of effort. And the more senior they get, the less easy it is for them to do something like that. So that's a huge plus. We're also able to bring people together, not just from different geographies around New York City or the East Coast, but from the West Coast to here, from Canada, from Latin America, and indeed from Europe. It's just hard to imagine how that would be done for a shorter meeting in New York City. It just isn't feasible. So that's a big plus. And the other thing is that while, let's put it this way, I think you really have to recalibrate in terms of the kind of meeting you're holding. So having a Zoom plenary session with 30 people on the screen is a sure path to disaster. No one can put up with that for a long period of time. But what we do is we break people up pretty quickly into small groups of workshops and case study activity where 5 or 6 people can sit down metaphorically together and work through something really interesting and then come back and talk about it in a bigger group meeting. Those types of sessions really make a huge difference. And I think that that's really the way forward for our organization. Actually, I don't think we'll ever go back to only face-to-face meetings, even if we can. I think that a lot of the feedback has been that people actually value this kind of quick but very integrated and very engaging work that can be done in the course of 2 hours instead of taking a half day to be part of it. So that's, I've been really surprised at how, when you do it right, Zoom can actually be a very powerful tool.
And cutting out the travel time too, as busy as people can be, just being able to, hop on, do whatever I need to do, and then go back and focus on other things again and run the company or whatever, there's got to be a tremendous savings for most of your followers as well.
Yeah, it's not only time savings, but also cost saving for sure. Now, as we go forward, I can imagine a time, I think, when this pandemic will be finally under control and people can travel more. But I do think that we'll see, and not just in our work, but I think across the board, there's going to be a transformed way of thinking about how to meet. And whether it's Zoom or some other technology, the whole idea that you don't have to necessarily travel around the world to have a 2-hour meeting is going to really change the way people think about meetings. I'd also say, though, that I'd be really surprised if we don't have any face-to-face meetings. So that would also be a problem. I think it's got to be a balance.
Yeah, I think of a lot of the people that I've interviewed, at least for the podcast, the one thing that a lot of people seem to miss are the human interaction and just the face-to-face time, and not necessarily talking about a specific topic or covering a specific topic, but instead really having that opportunity to just be social with one another, where oftentimes on Zoom meetings, at least for me, they're very focused. We get in and have to hit a specific topic pretty hard and then move on. And so that's been sort of a challenge, is losing that time to just go have a coffee or go have a beer or whatever. It'll be nice to get back to that portion of a normal.
Yeah, and on that front, I think it's, again, an interesting challenge with these digital ways of communicating. How do you create a personal space and really off-duty time, the equivalent of stopping by the coffee machine or the water cooler, I guess. I'm not sure water coolers exist in a lot of places anymore, but the water machine. And I think that one way we do it, which has proved pretty effective, is to create this happy hour approach where people may or may not actually have an alcoholic drink, but they're basically feeling like they're not asked to have a point of view on a topic or to be doing some specific task. It's really an open mic, if you like, for people. And if it's handled in the right way, which again takes a certain amount of EQ, I think that kind of thing works really well. We typically put 5 to 6 people together for that. No special agenda, or it's a very simple and lighthearted agenda. What would you like if you had your druthers? What would you choose for dinner tonight? It's not a profound insight, and it just breaks the ice, and then people can start to talk about other things. And they do get into issues of how their job is going, whether the people in their organization are really performing the right way under all the stress of the pandemic. They get into a lot of topics that are totally unscripted. So it does work, but it takes an extra effort to make that happen for sure.
So one last topic in terms of the leadership growth side of things. In my consulting practice, I focus a lot on operational excellence. So that's primarily where I'm focused for most of the companies. And what I see oftentimes is that leaders, as the company grows and accelerates, let's say from a nothing sort of startup, it was an idea in somebody's head all the way through to, hey, they made it to 10 or 20 million. Now all of a sudden, leadership becomes a little bit more serious of a game. But now you've got, let's just say you move from the 10 to 20 people. This thing, actually, I blog posted on it last night, that this sort of leadership drag starts to hit where people don't necessarily understand what your company's about anymore. People don't understand necessarily how to get things done to move the ball down the court. They're doing lots of things, not to say that people aren't working very hard in a startup or in other companies, but this idea of pointing the North Star for people and making sure that people really understand where you're going to becomes much, much more critical. And so when you're working with leaders, do you plot out like an actual curriculum for them and help them understand, here's some of the critical things you should be working on, and maybe some of these other things you could set aside for later, or actually have a more of a pathway for them to get to that future state?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also a great observation about the scale issue and people numbers issue. I think one thing that I've noticed is if you have a situation where not everyone could fit into a room, whether it's physically or on Zoom or one or another media, then that's actually a good sign that you're needing a much more serious level of leadership. And so that's right with your point of, say, 15 to 20 people. I think that in our own experience, what we try to avoid is a cookie cutter type approach to things. And instead, we focus more on a playbook idea. And by playbook, I mean that We do have a lot of things that we've learned over time and a lot of ways to approach certain issues or challenges, but we try to see how that maps to what the individual or the group actually need. And it's remarkable how often people don't ask people what they see as their need, but people are usually pretty good at diagnosing what they're good at and what they're not so good at or where they need help, especially if it's a non-threatening environment. If it's obviously a judgmental kind of approach, there's going to be a different reaction. But if it's really, how can you become even better at what you want to do? It's quite interesting how people will volunteer the areas where they need help. They might describe it in a way that's different than what is necessarily how I would see it, but once you hear what they say, you can get to that point. For example, someone might say, my team is not really united in how they operate, and I'm very frustrated by the way they're all going in different directions. The real problem might be that leader is not being very clear about what's needed. And certainly, I personally have that problem a lot. I assume people know what I want, but that's not a very good assumption. So anyway, things like that. And then based on that kind of feedback and insight, then we can tailor what would be a good program of leadership development for them, which will, in our case, often involve a lot of fireside chats, external visitors talking about how they dealt with similar issues. So very little, if any, didactic teaching, but much more getting others to help show the way. And also getting the people who are involved in this work to show the way themselves by talking about, if I was to do this differently, what would I do? Okay, well, let's just think about that. There probably is something you would do differently. And by talking about what that would be, you'll become a much better leader.
It's so important to be able to see somebody else that's walked down the same path or a similar path. And sometimes just having that, it will help you maybe see other ways. Because it's funny, the other day I had a conversation with somebody about adult learning, and the same sort of topic came up. We don't all learn the same way. We don't all characterize things the same way. And so with that, you need people that can reflect you a little bit and put you back in your place and say, hey, you could be communicating this a different way. Or you could, rather than just maybe sending out an email, you could actually have a Zoom meeting where you communicate face-to-face with your people. And it is so important to have that dialogue as well.
Yeah, and one thing that I found is really valuable is when we can encourage the people who are providing richer experience from perhaps their CEO, and they're talking to a group of people who are not, about a certain leadership thing. What's amazingly helpful is when they talk about how they failed at this in some way, when they either recently or years ago, and what they learned from it. Because it, first of all, you learn a lot from people's mistakes, probably more than their triumphs. And secondly, it helps people realize that all of these senior leaders or CEOs are people too, and they stumbled their way along the leadership road and made a lot of mistakes. The big difference sometimes, though, is that they learn from their mistakes, and we're happy to talk about them. But that sets a good role modeling as well, that not everything is perfect, because we all have a tendency when we get in a room with people to talk about as if there were no mistakes and no problems. And what people really value a lot is hearing someone who's a very well-regarded leader talk about how they failed and didn't make it out of high school or managed to be fired out of their second job. Those kinds of things are really quite profound.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to change gears on you a little bit, because I've spent a little bit of time actually looking on Harvard Business Review articles that you've authored. There are 3 specific ones out of the 15 that I'm going to pick a little bit on. And we don't necessarily have to talk about the articles themselves. I'll post links to those. People can go to them. They can refer to them. I think that the sort of title of them, in addition to the subject matter, are really things that I'd like to pick up on. So the first 2 articles, in my mind, they focus on product development. And the first article, Rescuing Scientific Innovation from Corporate Bureaucracy. The main point that I took away from that was keeping R&D teams small. In organizations like Loxo is the one that you use overall in the article. So do you have insight into how this benefited the organization in terms of product development and recommendations that you might have for companies that are going through that now?
Yeah, so I think that certain product areas don't require a lot of innovation necessarily. I think every new product has some level of innovation, but it may not be a lot. It might be a small change in a existing product, and it's presented as a new product, which is fair enough. I think when you're in the area, though, that at least I'm familiar with, of biomedical, pharma innovation, then you're really looking at pretty profound new things, and they take a lot of courage, I'd say, to develop. They often are very fragile in the sense that it's easy for someone to say no to something, but harder to promote it. And that's, I think, where the whole idea of having smaller groups of innovators with very little bureaucracy is very important. And unfortunately, it's a little counterintuitive to what big companies may often do. They'll often have gigantic labs and R&D groups, which have a lot of layers, have a lot of management in the midst of it. And unintentionally, that can squish innovation easily. And one of the CEOs that I worked with famously said at one time that he wished that the head of R&D was a little less active because every time he did something, he killed something. And that's what big companies often do, is that they find problems with things as opposed to opportunities. And it's always safer to find a problem than to promote something that might have issues, but is really worth promoting. Courage and tenacity in that area are really important, but it's very hard to have those qualities when you've got 6 layers of people. You have multiple managers and groups, and the groups themselves are very large, as you were alluding to in a different way. Once you have too large a group of scientists, even really good scientists will get kind of bogged down in their own mini bureaucracy, and or there may be a bit of tribalism. One group thinks it's better than the other because it's bigger, all these kind of crazy things. It's quite important, I think, for CEOs and heads of R&D to focus on how to keep it small, keep it simple, and keep it flat.
Yeah, I think Jeff Bezos even uses that, the pizza team sizing, right? If you can't feed your team with the size of a decent sized pizza, then, maybe you should look at having small teams. I've certainly been a part of these organizations before where they've had 30 people on a development team, and it's not uncommon. You get immersed in this process way of thinking about it instead of thinking about the innovation. How do we really build the best thing? And at the end of the day, it's more, how do we fit this thing into our process and still make it succeed? And to that point, it would definitely lead back to this circle of, hey, look, maybe the right idea is to kill this thing because it's not going to necessarily fit in the box that we've created for it.
I think that's exactly the issue that I see too. And that was the point of our piece, really. And my co-author at MIT was really speaking from his own experience too about how to do that. Other elements of what we talked about that also are very important, though, is to be rewarding the right things, to be, of course, selecting the right people, and having a real ear to the ground as to how things are going and how people are feeling about what they're working on. And all that stuff is essentially another way of describing leadership.
Yeah. And so now I'm going to jump to the second article. So the second article is, this pharma company stays innovative by doing 2 things. And in that article, you describe the 2 things as being these 2 things. So number 1 is realigning incentives for employees. And then number 2 is systematically introducing outside talent and practices, which you just more or less touched on. But again, these 2 ideas that I extracted from this article, again, provide a little bit of brilliance in terms of this is setting sort of the standard of, hey, look, maybe we're not really, paying or incentivizing people in the direction of being innovative. And number 2, we're also maybe not always bringing in ideas that would change the game for us.
Yeah, it's very puzzling to me, actually, that in many pharma companies and biotech companies, salespeople are routinely going to be able to earn more than R&D people through sales incentives and other things. And also top management, of course, will see itself as entitled to be earning dozens or even 100 times the multiple of the people who actually generate the innovation. And so I think it's worth asking, why is that? You can even find another CEO. You probably can't find the innovator for the product. And yet the CEOs typically treat themselves as uniquely important and worth an awful lot of money. But are they, compared to the people who create the innovations? And likewise, even if you just measured level for level of salespeople versus people in the lab, why shouldn't you encourage innovation in the same way you encourage sales performance? If you did, you might also get different results, that people would be rewarded for generating new products that make a difference versus simply ticking over for another week and having another team meeting. It's people are really quite responsive to how they're treated and also how they're valued. And so I think that's really important. And then on that other front of bringing kind of new ways of thinking about innovation into the system, again, in this respect, scientists, I think, are sometimes quite averse to other types of innovation. They may see themselves as the keepers of what innovation really is. But I think what was really interesting about Roivant and the example they developed among many was to bring in some people from outside the science world to think about how to make development more efficient. Now, these people would probably not be really helpful in identifying a new molecule, but they did have some great insights about how to speed up and make more efficient the development process. And one of the examples that we gave in that piece, as I recall it, was figuring out ways to help the patients with various forms of dementia and Alzheimer's get to clinical trial sites. They couldn't do it easily on their own. Their families couldn't do it easily. So they came up with a pretty simple idea, but a really smart one of utilizing new resources like Uber and Lyft to help bring people to the site so that they could get the appropriate testing done and back home. Very simple idea, but without that, they might have had an attrition rate that was very high on people attending. They managed to get a lot of people in at a very, very efficient rate. And as we know, development is the most expensive part of the whole innovation and product cycle. So if you can speed that up, you're really doing something very important.
It brings to mind to me this idea of being forced to think new or having additional ideas in the room. Both are the same thing. And the pandemic in a lot of ways has forced all of us to think new, right? So somebody had said the other day, I was reading an article on GM and the fact that they were trying to bring ventilator technology to market. And I guess now the reference back to the CEO is, hey, we want things to happen ventilator fast. And so that's their new reference at GM, but it came about because of the struggle of, hey, look, we've got to think differently. We can't think the same.
Yeah, we're speaking of those networks that we have created. One of them is for life science leaders, so it's CEOs and C-suite leaders. And in the next month, in February, we'll be holding a session with this group that is going to address a couple of topics. And one of them is going to be the question of how can we learn from the COVID vaccine process of better ways of getting things to market, because clearly some special things were done that weren't necessarily in the science side of things, but were more in the efficient development side of things. And for example, there was unprecedented, I think, parallel work being done by companies and the FDA, so that rather than waiting for the proverbial person to come out of a cake at the end and then decide whether you like it or not, the FDA was involved stepwise with the process. So they knew what was going to be coming and could give mid-course correction. And so it may be that things like that are going to be some of the big learnings or something else, but it's going to be really interesting to see what these executives see as the way forward for accelerating the path of development.
It was interesting. I looked at the FDA's website. I want to say it was in November in terms of overall product developments related to COVID. And 80% or greater than 80% of the developments were still in process. And yet a couple of weeks later was whenever they really started talking about vaccines being released. And all I kept thinking was, we still have the greatest amount of innovation that's still coming through the process. And so we clearly learned how to deliver things fast, but we also have some things that are still, frankly, for a lot of people and a lot of patients, hopefully, still will be benefited by that. And I think that'll be phenomenal. Again, going to change gears on one last article here. And I've been a strong believer for a long time that you have to start with kind of a broad view of the picture and then narrow your focus very quickly in terms of how do you get to the end point with teams or even with companies. And so this idea of really focusing in on results is something that I strongly believe in. And your article titled The Strategic Side Gig provides an excellent view of how leaders should maybe broaden their view or think, outside of the box and not always keep that very narrow view. And so I guess, have you seen how this benefits people that you work with in terms of taking that broader view and perspective?
Yeah, that's a piece that I did with Orland Boston, who's your partner at EY and a good friend of mine. And we both put our heads together in terms of what might really make a difference in terms of the way people should think about their own careers. And that's what came out. And I think what our thesis really has been is that it's important to have things that you do outside your day job that are different, though, from things like hobbies or passions, although those are very important. But these are things that are really strategic choices that you make to get involved in something that'll broaden you in terms of your experience and capabilities. For example, I ski a lot. I don't think skiing cuts it to this. It's great, but I don't see it as something that's really changing the way I think about my work. However, being the co-chair of a nonprofit over the past years in the area of homelessness has been really quite valuable, because I've learned a lot about how to work in a board and with a board, how to think about the role of a board versus management, which is always like theoretically there, but how do you keep yourself from getting too, in the weeds and irritating the people who are actually in management, all that stuff. Yeah, I think it's a tremendously important thing to do. And I also think it's going to be even more important to the sort of newer generation of people in jobs who I think don't have a lot of patience for being told to just sit around and do one thing and not get out and get around. But I think it's important to kind of channel that so that it's really doing something valuable as well as being fun. And so I do see that happening with people around me. I also see it in some of the organizations that I work with. And again, I think a good example is Roivant and their founder and CEO, Vivek Ramaswamy, a really interesting guy who does not only work on the science story and the business story for his company, but he also does a lot of writing and thinking on what's the right way of looking at society and democracy. These are cool things that not that many people in the world of biotech get involved in, but I think that the more you do that, the better you get at your job.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, this idea of stepping outside of what you currently do, it's so important at times. And yes, hobbies and other things are important, but at the same time, I think finding other ways that you can still lead, or finding ways that you can just do things that actually continue to build and hone your skills are beneficial to you as well as a professional. And maybe that's not necessarily your hobby or sitting in your basement or doing something in your garage or whatever. It's actually contributing to your professional life and building you as an individual or professional overall.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So you have an extensive history with the life sciences industry, and one idea that I'd really like to try and extract from you as well is, do you think that things will be any different now post the initial COVID wave? We all think we all are going to be living with COVID for some time, so I don't want to act like it's going to go away. What are your sort of impressions of the future now versus maybe 6 months from now? Do you think that anything changed or will change significantly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure I'm equipped to fully answer it, but at least my impression would be one thing that would be really big is greater efficiency and speed of movement from idea to a product. And I think the vaccine story demonstrated at least how that can happen. And now it'll be harder, I think, for teams to say we need another 5 years to get where we're going when that got done in less than one. Now, there were some unique qualities to that, and there was a lot of work that lay behind it already. But nevertheless, it's quite astonishing, but it's also a real opportunity to learn about speed to market, which I think is really important in terms of the cost of doing things. The faster you get it there, the less it costs often, and also just plain efficiency of the effort. The other thing that I think is really interesting to watch, whether the public perceptions of science and life sciences is going to stay as positive as it is today. Or to put it another way around, I think the life sciences and healthcare world have a huge opportunity to really change the equation on perception, which has been very negative in many cases, and turn it to something that's more supportive and positive. But to do that, of course, you have to continue to behave in a proper way and avoid giving people reasons to think that you're not only dedicated to health, but are more dedicated to profit or whatever it may be. So I think it's in the hands of the industry now, or the individual companies, to continue to be as dedicated to positive aspects of healthcare as they have been as they've been perceived to be over these past 9 or 10 months.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like to end the show with the same three questions for every guest. What inspires you, Ken?
What inspires me, I think, is people who, as we were talking about before, seem to broaden their careers and keep moving, building on capabilities versus just having a job. So I think that's important, not so much by financial achievement, but by the sense of having really applied their skills in the best possible way over their career.
And what concerns you?
Well, looking forward, I think what concerns me a lot is really the bases of democracy in this country. I think it's been under a lot of stress, and I do think it's a resilient place. There's plenty of examples from history where things have fallen apart, and I'd hate to see that happen here. But I am quite concerned about the what to me seems like a relentless attack on some of the foundations.
Yeah. Yeah, I can certainly sympathize with that. And I hope it's one of those moments where we come out of this a better country or stronger overall as well. And what excites you?
Let's see, what excites me in a personal level, I think what excites me is getting out of the house eventually and being able to do things I like doing, like skiing. And that's a pretty micro element, but I think that applies to a lot of us. And I guess the other thing that excites me is the resilience and the remarkable accomplishments of all of the health workers around the world. I think all always appreciate it, but we sometimes forget what it really entails. But I have been just excited to see and appreciative to see the way this group, which runs the gamut from doctors to people who clean the floors, but all of them, I think, just really remarkably committed to getting that job done, even when it threatens their lives.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I saw this morning on the news, all the lines currently in California where cars are just on the road for miles waiting for COVID tests or waiting to go to the hospital. And it's just something that I don't think is easy to fathom, but the pictures do start to at least give you a little bit of an understanding. And I've not been in a hospital since all of this started, especially not in a COVID wing. And for sure, we owe our absolute gratitude to all the healthcare workers that are out there doing this every day and taking care of people. Ken Banta, I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today and sharing with us so much about your history, perspectives, and leadership and so forth. I wish you all the luck.
Thanks for having me, and it's been terrific to talk about these different things. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.